This is just a quick run through of a presentation on the idea of developing a slow research approach, particularly for practitioners in schools. The context for this particular presentation is to think about a project I've been involved with, working with a group of schools in Blackburn and trying to help them develop some small-scale research projects around some curriculum development they've been doing. The group of schools I've been working with are very diverse in nature, very different kinds of intakes, but the project was actually developed mainly through the Slow Education charity with the help of an organisation called Curious Minds. And really the whole idea was to try to develop some research to support and capture some very simple data around some project-based learning projects that were being developed over the course of the year. Worked with 8 teachers from 5 schools who had a very broad range of prior research experiences, but many of the teachers hadn't really done any major structured research before. The project began in July 2014, and as I say, really the research was in many ways an attempt to add an extra dimension just to help capture and systematise some of the insights gained from the work that the teacher group were undertaking. This is a diagram that a couple of us have been working on for about a year now, really just to sort of think about what some of the main elements of research literacy might be about. And this is sort of really, I suppose, a background to some of the ideas that we're now developing around trying to help people understand and develop their own research literacy. And it works on the notion that if you want to develop your research literacy, in other words, being able to read and critically understand research, being able to perhaps complete research yourself, there needs to be 3 broad areas that you begin to develop your understanding around. One is developing a knowledge base around research, and particularly research methods, understanding different types of methodology, understanding different perspectives on research, understanding how to collect and analyse data, but actually underpinning that with the notion of what some of the big sort of concepts, possibly even threshold concepts, are within research. But then importantly, if you're wanting to really get a critical understanding and to be able to sort of really think carefully about the limitations of the research process, we would argue that actually applying those ideas and actually undertaking some form of small-scale research at some point is a really crucial step to take. So in terms of actually thinking about some of the main areas that we looked at during several days over the course of the past year, we had a number of study days, 4 I think it was in total, and we talked about various elements of the research process. Really fundamental to that was the idea of asking good research questions. What kind of questions did they want to ask about when beginning to think about the project-based learning that they were developing? Putting ethics right at the centre of the work that we were doing, and trying to think carefully about what an ethical approach would look like, both in terms of an ethical approach with the people involved, i.e. themselves and students, but also wider notions of ethics about being transparent, about potentially reporting findings and doing that in an ethical way, etc. We then looked through some basic notions of methodologies, and 2 of the main sort of distinctions that we picked up on really was the difference between evaluative research and explorative research. Evaluative research really being about perhaps trying to understand better the dynamics and the impacts of things we're already doing, or trying to evaluate how their project-based learning had gone, so perhaps using some before and after data collection, or an exploratory method, which is more sort of action research based, actually looking at getting some information but using that as the source of really thinking through what the intervention might look like, using that as a way of deciding what the intervention will be, as opposed to having a ready stated intervention and just topping and tailing it as an evaluative process. Actually using some of the initial data, and also using data that you're collecting during the course of the intervention to amend it and change it, try and make it better before evaluating it to a degree at the end, to understand how the work has developed. We spent time discussing data collection tools, thinking about different types of interviewing, thinking about how you might create a good questionnaire, thinking about how you observe, those kinds of ideas. And then also a general introduction to data analysis, some simple descriptive statistics which might be useful if questionnaires have been used with Likert scales, etc. And also thinking about sort of very basic ways of doing some simple coding. Before going on to think about approaches to writing and reporting, how actually do you write? What kind of writing? Do you use the first person? Do you use the passive tense or not? How do you get a level of tentativeness into the way that you're writing? Those kinds of ideas. But perhaps one of the most important elements, and something that I'm becoming personally more interested in, is the whole idea of advocating what you might call a slow approach to research. So this is taken from the notion of slow education, and is about, in part, trying to think of a philosophy that opens up spaces for dialogue, opens up spaces for discussion, debate, reflection as part of an ongoing process of learning and development. And therefore, one of the things that we attempted to do within all of the time that we spent with one another was to try and make sure that there were points in the day or time for unstructured discussion, to allow people to expand out discussions and follow interesting queries and questions, rather than constantly feeling that everything has to be very tightly structured, that actually that sort of false notion of efficiency is actually goes against the grain of more expansive general discussions about teaching, learning, research, etc. That through a slow process and having those discussions, it gives more of an opportunity for sharing genuine insights and ideas. But certainly my work with the group was one based around trying to develop a regular contact, not through having lots and lots of study days, but also having those interspersed with twilights, almost surgery sessions where it was more one-to-one, and being able to give people ideas and possible avenues for development. And as a consequence, one of the things that appears to have happened over the course of the year is the idea of this notion of emergence of ideas and approaches, rather than everything being set in stone right at the start, is allowing ideas, allowing approaches to the way that they want to look at what they've done to emerge over time, part of their own learning process. And really important, as far as I'm concerned, is the notion of having time to play and explore, having time to play with ideas, rather than having some kind of predetermined list of things to do that have to be adhered to absolutely to the letter. It's important that any research process has coherence and has a logical format, but that it doesn't become too tied down. Because obviously one of the important elements within any kind of work in this way is that there are going to be times when mistakes are going to be made, and there are problems, and that's all part and parcel of the process of learning how to carry out research. Also, what seemed to develop through this year is the notion that by taking this slow process, it was giving ample opportunity for the development of professional capital traits, people being able to develop their own understanding, not only of research, but more importantly of project-based learning and how they might apply that within the classroom. But doing that within a supportive group of other individuals, and also having a lot of decisional capital, being able to make their own decisions about what they were going to do. So just some sort of reflections really on taking this kind of approach. The main and most important thing is that whilst it was an opportunity to help people begin to understand how to undertake research, the project-based learning projects were the centre of the process, and that's as it should be. And therefore, right at the centre of all of the work that the group has been doing is the idea of the focus on the children and the focus on deepening and expanding their education and their the context for their learning and the context for teaching. Really, the research has merely been a way of trying to help people have a little bit more structure in reflections and moving beyond personal reflections, moving towards actually collecting some kind of relatively logical framework of data to be able to make more coherent and perhaps more critical comments and insights about what it is they've actually been doing over the course of the year. So it's not full-blown big-scale research, but it's a major move in the direction of using research as a structured tool for more coherent reflection and development of practice than merely personally reflecting in a very informal kind of way. It's given people an opportunity to engage with at least some literature and begin to think about how that might help them in their wider day-to-day practice. And it's given people just the opportunity to explore and experiment with simple research tools within a supportive professional environment. Becoming a researcher takes a huge amount of time and energy and effort. It's not something that can happen over the course of one project. But by giving people the space and the time and the opportunity in a supported way to begin to explore and experiment with those research tools, it's helping them begin to think about how that might become part of their practice if that's what they want as they move into the future. Just to give two very quick examples of some of the things that have been done. One really interesting case was a project focused around helping students develop their understanding of what we mean by culture, and the evidence was really interesting, using things like student drawings. What did they think culture looked like, and using those as a stimulus in sort of informal interviews to try and draw out what students understood by culture, but then how they understood that in a different way, if at all, after a project about culture and the different cultures within the class that was involved. And some of the insights that were gained from this were really quite major shifts in the kind of images and dialogue that students used around the notion of culture. And as a consequence of that particular project, notions of a greater sense of community, a greater sense of people understanding other cultures in a more positive kind of way, and just using some of those tools to try and help the teachers sort of draw that out. A second case was actually a really wonderful example of how beginning to do some research can actually lead to a whole series of results all the way along that aren't expected, but even though in very bland terms it might be seen as the research throwing up a whole series of negative results, how that can actually still lead to really important insights and actually help generate new positive insights and practices. So in this case it was a project about trying to get students to develop their own questions as a basis for independent learning. And the evidence came from a number of different areas, from the teacher's own research diary that they kept over the course of the work students had created, observation and informal interviewing. And actually there are a whole series of points along the process where the teacher would gain insight, would gain results from students, and actually find that what she might have expected to happen didn't. And as a consequence, all the way along, her own personal assumptions about learning, etc., were being constantly challenged, which actually meant that one of the major outcomes was really a major re-evaluation about sort of children's learning and the kind of activities that might be used within the classroom to support that. So even though the process itself may have been seen as constantly leading to negative results, it's a wonderful example of how negative results can actually lead to a huge amount of learning, that we shouldn't just research things that we think we already know the answers to and expect positive results from. I suppose sort of some of the main final reflections are ideas around members of the group who have verbalised the idea that they feel that the projects, certainly the projects on project-based learning themselves, have been absolutely transformative, and that actually by having these days where they're talking about the kind of work that they're doing on project-based learning and the kind of way that they're supporting some of their emerging understanding of that through the research process, has really been valuable to them, actually having that time and space to discuss and grow ideas, and seems to very much support the notion that if we just slow down ideas around research and innovation and transformation, that actually a lot more can come from the process. Research should be a slow process. It's not something that we should try to sprint through at a very fast rate of knots. That there was a real feeling from the group of a heightened sense of professionalism, that actually they felt they were having far deeper, more professional discussions about their practice and student learning than perhaps is the case a lot of the time. And that really, from talking to them, what the researchers helped do essentially is to help them begin to systematise the insights they're gaining to a certain extent. It hasn't perhaps led to a transformational shift in the way that they see their work. It's not to suggest that research is going to be an embedded element in everything that they do, but actually members of the group did talk about the idea that it's actually given them more confidence in some of the reflections and has helped them to systematise some of the insights they've gained. And as a consequence of all of this, we're having a celebration day on the 8th of July, and there is a keen desire from the group to develop a project-based learning, slow education network, to develop some of these ideas further next year. The degree to which research will be an explicit element of that is still to be seen, but nevertheless, just by having this slow process, giving people a chance to discuss, it's actually sown, or appears to have sown, really strong foundations for developing an inter-school network over the next year. So, initial insights and reflections. A slow process seems to be a really fantastic way to begin to develop deeper practice, time to grow, time to discuss ideas, not allowing sort of fast time, all of the sort of stuff that we have to do day to day, answering emails, filling in forms, inputting data, etc. Not allowing all of that to erode away an element of slow engagement with ideas and with practice and developing an emerging practice. From my view as a researcher, I think there's been a really sort of genuine and positive interaction with research processes, a real thirst for trying to engage and understand how that might help develop practice in a more critical way, and that actually the data collection techniques have been very simple. We've not tried to create very complex approaches to research. It's just been a way of helping people dip their toe into a research process, use some simple tools, but that has actually helped augment the reflective process. And as a consequence, through some of the reading, through an engagement in this way, there has been a developing research literacy amongst those involved. And as I say, is part of a slow process. If this were to continue to develop over a long period of time, I have no doubt that this is something that people could develop much further. What will be the residual impacts with respect to research itself? I don't think we can say, and to a certain extent I don't personally feel that that's overly important. It's been a useful tool for augmenting the experience of professional growth and the development of pedagogy over the course of this year. If that's where it stops, that's absolutely fine. If people wish to take it further, equally, absolutely brilliant. But at the same time, it's about accepting that any movement into this is going to be a series of small steps. Research is a very complex area, both conceptually and linguistically, and as a consequence we can't expect people to become experts overnight. It takes a long time. I've said on several occasions now, I've been doing research both in natural and social sciences for over 20 years now, and I would see myself now as a passably good researcher. I certainly wouldn't say that in terms of research methods and research literacy I'm an absolute expert. Don't know that anybody is, but it's taken a long time to engage and develop that complexity of understanding. We can't do it overnight.